So welcome everyone to our monthly webinar. Today's event is about PR 101, what you need to know about getting access to the press. This is sponsored by My Pinnacle Network, Rockland Trust, and South Shore Networking Professionals. Joe, can you give an intro or welcome from My Pinnacle Network?
Sure, Steve. My Pinnacle Network, we're a business-to-business networking organization. We have 5 locations, Westboro, Mansfield, Needham, Braintree, and Pembroke. Again, our focus is on business-to-business professionals. We have monthly meetings, and we're a proud sponsor of these free webinars as well. We hold a lot of events both at our meetings and outside the meetings. And we've been around, Steve, believe it or not, we're going on 10 years in 2022. So we've been around a good while already.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. It's yeah, and we keep getting younger. That's the good part. I'm going to read a quick intro and welcome from the Rockland Trust. They offer a wide range of banking, investment, and insurance services to businesses throughout Eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island. They are also online, mobile, and have phone banking. And our other sponsor, South Shore Networking Professionals, are a group that meets throughout the South Shore when COVID allows. So that's a whole nother webinar. We won't get into that right now. But let me introduce our panelists and we'll get started. So first, Jon Chesto is a Boston Globe business reporter, was with the Patriot Ledger. Many of you may have already pitched him stories and he's already said no. Today, he'll tell you how to get him to say yes. We also have with us Ed Perry from WATD, the founder of WATD and several other radio stations, and a legend on the South Shore. So thank you for joining us, Ed. And we also have Jim Borghesani, who is a former Boston Business Journal reporter, former Patriot Ledger reporter, and led the initiative to legalize marijuana, also known as cannabis, in Massachusetts. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
So let's get started by talking about maybe the thing that annoys the press most, which is when people pitch a story that really isn't news. And so I think it's probably appropriate to start with Ed, because he is a guy who coined the DAGUS theory. Could you explain that academic algorithm?
Yes, what we do with what I hope our news department does with news, and recently I haven't been able to get into the news department as much as I wanted to, because we've had 2 radio stations that we were rebuilding, one in Brockton and one in Boston. That's WMEX, which we're just selling. But one of the things that I always looked at when it comes to news is that it is the DAGUS theory. Is that first of all, you have to ask people, does anybody care about this? When you come up with a news story, or somebody wants to run a news story, the first thing that you ask is the DAGUS thing. And if the very first question you say is, what's in it, and does anybody care? And so the first question you ask is, frankly, does anybody give a shit? DAGUS. I used to say that was founded by Professor George Dagas, who taught literature and broadcasting for Boston University. But the fact of the matter is that it's just something that you have to ask. And if the answer is no, then you can essentially say, okay, we're not going to do that. But if the answer is yes, and you're not doing it, then you got to figure out a way of doing it, because if people, you've got to get people to care about it, because the question, if first you think nobody cares about it, if the answer is no, daggers, to does anybody give a shit, that then you have to bring in your professionalism and say, should they? And if the answer is no, then you just forget it. But if the answer is yes, then you have to go to work and make that story presented in a way that will get people to care about it. And that's the Daggis test. And you know, the fact is that we are just overrun with people wanting to get their stories on the radio. And we have to continuously run that Daggis test because there's oftentimes there's not much difference between functional news or focused news and advertising. And if somebody is, if it's truly news, even though it may be somebody who has the capability of spending money with you to get that story out, you still have to do it because that's what news is about. On the other hand, you have to see when a presentation from some business or some organization is really an advertisement for them and doesn't really do a lot of good for the public, then you have to notice not to take it. So those are the challenges that we sort of face when somebody calls up and says, hey, I got a great news story for you. You have to think about it and you have to run the Daggis test.
Thank you, Ed. And thank you for coining and sharing that phrase. Jon Chesto, let me go to you. At the Boston Globe, you're sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the market, but in reality, the news hole has shrunk. The news hole of how much news you can run on a daily basis is based on advertising. And obviously retail advertising is significantly down. Your challenge now is to try to fit the most critical news into that smaller space. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's a constant struggle. We I guess run our own versions of Ed's Daggis test every day or every moment almost. I mean, we're deluged with pitches. I'll just give you an idea so you have a sense of the geometry of the paper as it stands now, at least with regards to business coverage. And of course, some of you will be making pitches that aren't necessarily business stories. They'll be making pitches to Metro. And we used to have a much more robust coverage of the South Shore, but we still do cover it through Globe Local. And so that is a great place to pitch stories that might not rise to Metro or to business. I can speak specifically for the business section in that we generally have, even though we are digital first and we post stories when we can, and we're really thinking about the homepage, and that drives a lot of our decision making. We also have to think about where these going to go run in print eventually, and we do have, as Steve noted, a smaller news hole than in the past. We've got probably anywhere between 4 and 8 places for local business stories on any given day in the business section. That's not including page one. We do run some business stories on page one. Hopefully we get one up there every day. And then we have, we have a new technology team, 2 new reporters joining, 2 reporters that we already had, and they are doing, they've got a new newsletter. So there's a place that you could get some, if it's technology related, they might be interested in running it. We also run a briefs column called Talking Points, where I generally write like a brief or 2 a day and drop it into there. If it rises to that level of, well, is this going to be of interest to people, a broad enough audience of people, I'll write up a brief. And then this just coincides with the return of a column I wrote for a few years called Bold Types, which is a personnel type column where we do little snippets or features about various people in the news, and that runs every Tuesday. I think that's sort of the general, at least what we have in terms of business, options for people who want coverage in the business section. And the bar is pretty high for those 4 or 5, 6 staff written stories. I mean, I reject many, and I propose some to my editors, and they reject some. So it's got to be really interesting to a broad array of readers. And sometimes that means maybe that's what your client is doing in and of itself might be newsworthy, but not big enough for a story, but maybe it's part of a larger trend. And we could use your client as sort of to exemplify that larger trend if we can find some other people to back that up. So I found that sometimes is one way to get clients into the paper.
Okay, thanks. And John, just one quick question. I know that the Globe has an enormous digital presence. Matt, can you mute yourself until you have a question? Matt?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you. So it's always a tech guy who has a problem with tech. So your digital numbers versus print, John, do you know those?
I don't know that. I'm reluctant to quote them offhand because I see numbers, but they change. But what I would say is, the numbers, once I finally see them, it's usually pretty old because they become public so much later. But what I would say is the numbers that I've seen were well over 200,000 in digital daily subscribers. And we're probably, I don't know, between 80 and 100,000 print daily subscribers, including newsstand sales. And obviously Sunday print is higher. But that's, we're unusual for a metro paper in that our digital subscribers far exceeds our print subscribers. That sort of inverse happened a couple of years ago, I think before the pandemic, but it's, of course, the pandemic has messed up our sense of space and time. And it was a major watershed. I grew up with print. I think most of us on the call did. I really love print, and I hope we have print product for as long as I'm at the Globe. But it's very important to build a digital subscriber base. And so it was seen as a real success story for the Globe. And you can see, if you Google it, you'll find stories, or a number of stories are written about it, that where we've really made the transition to digital subscriptions to support, because we have had a real loss of advertising. And it used to be advertising, especially classified advertising, which is sort of withered away over the last 20 years, really underwrote the newsroom to a large extent. Now we're really counting on subscribers, our readers, to pay the costs of the newsroom. So it's, we have a pretty hard paywall in terms of getting stories. And I know it drives some people crazy, but we've got to pay the bills somehow, and asking readers to pay for what they're reading is how we've decided to pay the bills. So we've been very successful in that. We have a very low introductory offer, and people, I think, tend to stick with us after that introductory offer expires. I believe it's a 6-month, like essentially a nominal fee.
Okay, thanks, John. We'll send on the commissions to you as you.
Yeah, please do.
You sold subscriptions today. Jim, let me go to you. Jim Borghesani, you've worked at the Ledger and the Boston Business Journal before you went to the dark side of public relations. Can you talk a little bit about when you were, especially at the BBJ, and people were pitching you stories, I guess in particular, what was the local hook or the regional hook you needed to see? And in general, what was your litmus test for what was appropriate for coverage in the Boston Business Journal?
Primarily to see and to make sure that it wasn't just, as Ed mentioned earlier, an advertisement for the company itself. A lot of times you'd get pitches and you'd look right away, you'd see it right away that it just wasn't news. It wasn't anything that was unique. that was, a new product or an interesting product or a new process or an interesting process, or, even a personality that was, interesting to readers. It was just, a company talking about what it's doing, which is all well and good. But if that didn't interest, a reader, in my opinion, or my editor's opinion, it wasn't going to get coverage. I don't know how many times when I was at the BBJ, I would get pitched by a lot of times trade groups, trade associations saying, we have a bunch of people coming to Boston, whether it's physicists or physicians, and we're having a gathering and it's going to be great, all the best minds. And I would say, well, that's great. But are they going to introduce like a breakthrough product, a new development that's going to help people? I said, well, no, but just these people are so, they're luminaries. And they think that because of this star power, somehow that was newsworthy, but it wasn't. Perhaps you could put it into, if I knew there was a personality there who was fitting into another story I was doing about, a trend or something like that, then yes, maybe you could set something up like that. But as for the news value of the gathering itself, it just wasn't there. So the litmus test for me was, is it an interesting product? Is it an interesting process? Is it an interesting personality? And if it didn't have, at least one of those, the chances of it getting, into print was pretty minimal. And I would say probably, I don't know, 80, 90% of the press releases I got, immediately I saw that there was just no news value there.
Right. And I think your challenge as an editor or as a reporter is how do you tell somebody their baby is ugly? Right?
Yeah. And one of the things, if you do hire a PR firm, and you've been hired, Steve, I've been hired, a lot of times you have to, be a reporter yourself and think, I have to ferret out the news story in this client or potential client. And it may not be the news story that the client thinks it is, but there may be something there. It may be something that their company is doing in the community. Maybe one of their employees is doing something to raise money, and it becomes a human interest story that does mention the company. So by, it's sort of like an ancillary mention, but your company still gets mentioned in the story. So sometimes, you get a pitch and then you realize that you've buried the lead, so to speak. There's another pitch there that actually is going to succeed, in getting the company into print. Maybe not directly something the company's doing, but at least something the company's involved with. That still is, you're going to see that company's name in the paper or on the radio or on TV or wherever you decide, whatever medium you decide to push it or to try for.
Okay, thank you. And Ed Perry, let me go back to you. I know that WATD does its best to cover community events, get involved with nonprofits, but your challenge in particular is you get inundated by nonprofits to promote their events, I assume initially for free. How do you deal with that?
Well, how we deal with that is basically we look at it and determine whether it's going to be good for the communities that we serve. And if an organization, a business, puts together a fundraiser for some cause that in fact is necessary to be supported in a community, and we've been seeing this, of course, throughout the virus pandemic, that more and more businesses are getting, frankly, they're getting free mentions on WATD because they have taken on by themselves, they've taken on to solve a problem that is facing the people who live in the communities that we serve. And, we're basically, we deliver the information. That's what broadcasting does, is it delivers information. And of course, we who run broadcasting, whether it's in the news department or the advertising department, what we have to try to do is to make sure that the information that we put out is interesting to our listeners so they continue to tune to our frequencies. But more than that, that it is going to help the communities that we serve and the people who need that help. And frankly, if you deliver that kind of broadcasting, ultimately you will be successful because people will want to listen to you. And the nice thing about broadcasting is that it's instantaneous. That, you know, yesterday they had a situation in Duxbury where somebody fired right near the elementary school, fired a gun accidentally into a house next to the school. And we had a reporter there just about the same, just shortly after it happened. So we have the ability in broadcasting to get this information out immediately. And then we now have the ability using the internet and social media to make it tangible. In the old days, tangibility was something that broadcasting couldn't do. Now we have the ability to put that stuff easily into print. And so that's what we look at is, and we let, during the pandemic, we let none of our news people go. We have, in fact, we've expanded the news department a little bit because this is when you need to have that information out to people. And frankly, when you do something like that, they remember you positively, and the businesses remember you positively as well. And it builds your revenues so that you can get back on your feet financially. So that's what we're doing.
Thanks, Ed. And John, let me go to you. So you're at the Globe. You're really busy managing various platforms where people are reaching out to you to pitch you stories. In general, what is the best time of day to pitch to approach you about a potential story? And also, what's the best medium to reach you so that it actually gets seen?
Well, I would say earlier in the day is always better. I mean, by the end of the day, the print layout is pretty much locked in. So, and you know, I start work at 9 o'clock. So, you know, I don't end the day at 5, but if you're pitching me a story at 5, it doesn't really leave me a lot of time to write the story. However, if it's something that can hold a few days, getting me after the deadline, which is usually, I would say 5:36 to 7, if I'm already off deadline, I've already filed my story, I'm sort of winding down for the day, and so you can get through to me then. But I would say earlier in the day is almost always better. And earlier in the week is almost always better for the same sort of reason. By the end of the week, we're sort of running around trying to patch up things for Saturday paper, for Monday paper, for Sunday paper. And so we talk about ourselves as being digital first, but we do pay close attention to what needs to go into the paper, and that takes some amount of work and planning. I prefer all pitches by email. I know most reporters do. It's very useful for if you have to forward it along. You know, I'll get calls and texts, but or people will pitch me on LinkedIn or Twitter. But if it's something that it's not in my bailiwick, I want to be able to forward it to a colleague. And email still is antiquated as that technology is. It's still the most effective way of getting a message across. I think I would say like there's a barrage of emails that we all get between like 6:30 and 9:30, and then maybe after that the flood slows down a bit. So that's probably a good time to drop emails to reporters.
Okay, great, thank you. And Jim, you and I have collaborated on some PR projects and continue to. What I wanted to ask you was, how do you prepare clients for an editor interview so that they show their best side without lifting up the rock and showing what's underneath that rock, which may be less of what you'd want to have show up in the media, although it is oftentimes the most colorful part of the story?
Yeah, I usually put something on paper, messaging points, the primary communication, points that you want the client to relay in the interview with the reporter. A lot of times there's fear of clients that they have just dealing with reporters, but the vast majority of the time, the reporter is primarily interested in the story that you're pitching. And unless it is a crisis situation or the client has done something controversial or criminally or civilly liable, then there's a problem. You have to have a whole different set of communications goals. But primarily, you put something down on paper. You sort of get the main message points that you want them to convey so that they don't forget anything. It's not that you're trying to, put your words in their mouths. It's just that you don't want them to forget any of the key points that they want to get over. That's going to be of importance to helping the reporter, structure the story. So really, it's identifying the points that you want to relay, putting them down on paper, and making sure that the client has them thoroughly, ingested before they get on the call.
And there is the rule of three that people believe in, that both the public and the press can only think of three things at one time. Do you try to limit talking points to three major concepts?
I don't. I remember during the various campaigns I've been in, we've always had the pyramid theory, the 3 points, which actually is pretty good because it just helps you organize those thoughts in your own head. And if you're stuck with something, you can always go back to one of those 3 points. But primarily, because sometimes, it depends on the story, you have to go beyond the 3 things. So I don't primarily think of 3 things. I try to organize the primary points, whatever quantity they may be. Okay,
great. And Ed, let me go to you. One of my questions is the news cycle these days. When I follow, it could even be the fallout from leaving Afghanistan. I think that only lasted a week, partially because Biden was smart enough to create some other flurry of activity that distracted the press. But do you see a news cycle of being a week or 10 days, or do you have any sense of how long things tend to linger in public interest and the press interest?
Well, they have to be something that people are truly interested in. I mean, if you want an example of this, how about the lovely lady who was killed and they can't find her boyfriend, her fiance. Here's a story that if you look at it practically, it's one person who was perhaps murdered by another person. And frankly, there are murders virtually every day in every state. And so it's a situation where, is it a story? Yes, of course it's a story, and it's important to people because it could happen to somebody that they know, but it's being presented in a way that becomes more than just simply news. Now basically it's a book. It's a fiction book. It's as good as any fiction book that you're gonna buy about murders, and it's a novel. And the people who put that together and continue to follow it, they've done a wonderful job with it. It keeps people interested. Is it news? Probably not really, not national news, but there are more important things that are national news. And it's the same thing that you get with Biden and the Afghanistan departure. That's a truly important thing. But there isn't very much that we can do about it at this point, but people do like to see it because it represents what the United States has done for 20 years and how they've discovered that, or at least come to the decision that perhaps it was not something that they wanted to do for the next 20 years. And so we've gotten out of it, but there's always going to be news that people think about, especially when you get Americans who are trying to get out of there killed by the terrorists. So it's really the question of news, of what is news. It's news when people are excited about it. It's news when people can be endangered by what is happening. It's news when people will be just thrilled if it does happen, and so on. And it's news is tangible, or intangible. It can be both. So that's the situation as I see it.
All right. Thank you, Ed. Let me go to you, John, if I may. When somebody is coming to you with a story for the Globe, and in particular for the business section, what kind of materials do you want from them? Do you want a press kit? Do you need photos? Do you need corroborating sources? What are the sort of things that you'd like to see that wrap it up in a bow that make it easier for you to say yes?
Well, to be honest, there's not a lot that you can add or subtract to make me say yes or no to doing a story. I mean, a one sentence pitch about some big event or some big development, it could have more persuasion than 5 pages of press releases.
Right.
But what I would say is if you do have a story that is newsworthy, and especially if I am interested or another Globe reporter is interested, I'll tell you what's helpful. That when you write press releases, I think there is sort of there's an obligation to quote various and sundry people, but for me, I almost never use quotes in a press release. I kind of dispense with all of that when I look at a press release. It's all becomes invisible to me. I'm scanning through to see any sort of nuggets of news. The quotes themselves generally are not real quotes. They've been sort of manufactured by people, either by underlings or by the people who are quoted themselves, to try to make it sound like the way they want articulate what they're trying to say. But by doing so, they've robbed their quote of any. As soon as you start thinking about how you want to say something, it doesn't sound like the way people talk. So the quotes are kind of meaningless to me. That's not to say I never use one, and that's not to say I don't find interesting things in them, but I generally just scan right through. What I do like to see are sort of bullet points of facts, historical facts, like about the organization. I do like to see if there are people outside of the group or client that could be quoted about this story, their contact information. It's helpful to have photos on hand. We don't always run photos from outside of the organization, outside the Globe in the paper, but what we do need high resolution photos for the website. And so if we don't have a photo of anybody mentioned in the story, that could be problematic in terms of how it gets played on the website. So coming armed with photos, not necessarily in the first pitch, but having them available if requested would be really great. I say not necessarily in the first pitch because sometimes a high-res photo can gum up the works in terms of just getting caught into email and spam and that sort of thing.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Jim, I mentioned you've been in 2 newsrooms, the Ledger and the BBJ. Can you give us some examples of what you see or some of the general topics of news that are of value to greater Boston audiences coming from business, the kinds of things that a business can announce that have some value and may see the light of day?
Yeah, if it's off the top of my head, if it's say real estate news, if a company is about to develop a parcel that everybody knows about, a particular area in Boston, Sullivan Square, or someplace, I'm trying to think of the most recent one, someplace on the waterfront that everybody knows about. That's generally, pretty big news. And people are interested in it because everybody's familiar with, that particular area. Another one will be a development of some kind of product that helps people in their daily lives, whether it's, local or national, but as long as it's a local company that's coming up with it, whether it's a new face mask or new technology, to help people, learn, or a new medical device that helps people, health-wise, something like that. That's certainly always news. And there's a certain cheerleader effect. I think journalists do like to write, about a company in their own backyard that's doing something, good. A lot of companies are doing something good. Hopefully that'll transition, the good will transition into something that's newsworthy as well. And often that is something that's new. And just quickly, it was mentioned earlier that there are different platforms. If you can't get into, say, the main Globe or the main Globe, website, digital page, yeah, there are zoned editions. There are newsletters, sometimes digital newsletters, that they need content too, and that's always something that I think the more knowledge that a company has, or the company's PR firm has, about different platforms they can pitch, the better success they're going to have in getting something placed.
And what are classic examples of non-news that business people are misinformed or over enthusiastic about that they pitch? Example: 10th anniversary of their business, not enough. Ribbon cutting, not enough. New vice president, not enough. Are those good examples? And
yeah, those are all good examples. They
Yeah.
used to be at the BBJ and at the Boston Globe. I think they used to be personnel news, and you could get something placed there, a new hire, something like that. But that was always one line. Now, a new hire isn't going to work unless it's like the Red Sox trying to get Billy Beane over from the Oakland A's. That's big news. That's a higher news. That's going to make news, but that's very rare. It doesn't happen all that often that you get somebody who's a personality who's moving into Boston, and they're bringing whatever expertise they have and their notoriety in. That's something that's going to interest, I think, reporters. But anniversary, milestones, ribbon cuttings, that may be something you say, yes, we're going to give it to the Duxbury Clipper or the Mariner papers, because they may be interested, but it's never going to get into, one of the larger papers. Maybe a digital web page where you send a photo of people standing, maybe it'll make it somewhere, but it's not going to make it, onto the Boston Globe, or I don't think WATD is going to put it on air.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Jim. And Ed, let me go back to you. I think that one of the dangers of pitching stories to you and to John and anyone else in the media is, when do you start to burn a bridge? When do you start to become a pest? And in addition to that, in your case, you're the owner of a radio station. Probably the better people to pitch for a story are your news director or your individual show hosts.
Well, what it comes down to is when we have a lot of separate shows, talk shows, that are owned by the people who put the show on, that they basically pay to rent equipment that we let them use. And then if they want to bring in guests that are in businesses that are not advertising with us, that may not really be stories at all, that's their business. Basically, if they want to do it, they can. Some of them do, some of them don't. But one of the things that I have stuck with here is that if my news department folks see a story that I think doesn't matter, or a story that is very positive for somebody that I've been trying to get to advertise for years, and they just said, too bad, go away, that I let the news department make that decision, even if it might get somebody the equivalent of free advertising for somebody that is buying only from our competitors. that I think you have to have that division so that when it isn't just me who may be emotionally tied to something, it's that you have to let your staff make decisions on things like that. And, you know, there are times when I've heard stuff on the air and I felt like picking up the phone and saying, how the hell did you put that on? Didn't you hear their ad on WBZ? You know, but you have to understand, as I have learned to do, I think, that if you're hiring people who are competent and intelligent and know the business, you let them do it. And if they make that decision that here's something that they think is a news story, even though I might disagree, they get to do it. And that's the first rule, I think, of broadcasting. And then we're so fortunate now that we have both the tangible and intangible delivery method. In the old days, people must remember this, that the FCC passed a rule, or the federal government passed a rule, that daily newspapers could not own a radio station. Weekly newspapers could, but daily newspapers could not, because they felt that the power that having both the tangible and intangible media available would make it impossible for other people to compete with them. And so, but now that we have the tangibility of getting onto something, getting onto the internet where people can push that button and print out what we send, just as the newspapers do. I think we have to, as broadcasters, we have to understand that we have a very powerful medium, and that it has to be delivered honestly, that what we put into that medium has to be viewed by our listeners and the people who read our stuff on the internet. It has to be viewed as truth. And that's the key to it, that especially when you're dealing with regional radio, because people, they're close to you. And if you start to say something that's not true, they're going to figure it out, even though it might be beneficial to the salespeople or the news people or whatever, that the local people will figure it out. So that's the theory I have on it.
Thank you, Ed. And Jon Chesto, let me go to you. It has been said in weekly newspaper newsrooms, we need to feature every child and adult in our paper at least once a year. From the Globe standpoint, how often do you really even want to provide visibility for a business in the community? Is there a once a year sort of general benchmark, or are there lots of other circumstances involved?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a limit, but we are cognizant of making sure we quote different people, or we try to. You know, I think in the past, the Globe, as many newspapers, have been guilty of kind of going to the same 4 sources for various topics that might be covered. And I think that this not only limits the diversity of thought and the texture of the stories, but you're also limiting the diversity of who you're talking to, the kinds of people you're talking to. So we're really making a conscious effort to try to quote and feature different people as often as possible. But it's not to say that if a company makes news, we don't cover it, because we covered it last week when they made news. So it's definitely on your mind. It's like, oh, okay, well, we just did a feature on them. We're probably not going to do another feature on them anytime soon. There's no magic time for when that expires. It's just more like, oh, you just kind of realize you want to spread the wealth a little bit.
Okay, very good. And thank you. And Jim, let me go to you. When you are working with local businesses to get their message out, part of what I think the new landscape of messaging is it goes beyond traditional media into social media, into podcasting, and there are other elements as well. How closely do you look beyond traditional media as somebody who is now practicing PR?
Not enough, frankly. I have to learn more about that. And I've learned, by talking to you more about that. There's so many different things you can do. You can do things like this. You can appear on something, a podcast such as you're hosting. You can do your own podcast. You can come up with a blog that you can then try to promote, but it has to have interesting content. You can put together different, news groups, if you will, and try to do, update that, once a week, twice a week. I have to learn more about that stuff. I'm guilty of being a traditionalist, thinking that, the stories I pitch are going to go to, a mainline source. And I know now that a lot of those, you can get it online, and that becomes important because that's searchable. It shows up on various platforms. So I freely admit that I have to get better at that. There's a whole world of different avenues and different platforms that have opened up because of social media. And a lot of it is making sure that your content is bright, is fresh. Nothing's worse than going onto a company's page and looking at the news section and seeing everything that was 6 months, 8 months old. So if you're going to have a footprint, a digital footprint, it really should be fresh, and it should be something that is going to help people understand exactly what you are and what you're doing sort of right now.
Okay, great. And John, I'm going to bounce back to you with two questions, a twofold question from actually Joe DeRamo on our staff, which is A, when you receive a news release, is it helpful to have bullet points to call out key information? And then B, is it helpful or annoying when we follow up via phone and say, hey, John, did you get the news release? And here are some story angles around that company that might be interesting.
I would say the first answer is yes. The bullet points are much more helpful than sort of a straight ahead news release for me. I realize that there are some outlets that might just publish a news release almost verbatim as a news story, but obviously that's not what we do at the Globe. And so I really, what I need is information. I don't need a well-written press release. I need nuggets of information that I can use and translate into my own story. So the bullet points are very helpful. In terms of following up, email is usually best because my phone rings a lot, even though I'm remote and you can only get me on my cell now. Even when I'm in the office, when I'm in the office, my cell and the office phone are ringing a lot, but my cell phone rings a lot. And so it's harder to get through to me there. And usually if it's not ringing, it's because I'm focused on getting something done under a tight deadline. While email I can respond to at a later time. And I don't really mind getting follow-up emails. I totally understand, that, you're pitching, you want to make sure that it goes through, the message gets through to me. Sometimes it helps because sometimes I will have missed the first email. So I highly recommend following up. If it's really pressing news or urgent, texting or calling is certainly not going to annoy me because I'll understand, but it shouldn't be done lightly, if you know what I mean, just because I've so many people calling me.
Okay. Well, that's great. And so that sort of answers many of the questions that I have. What I want to do is allow a little bit of time, for the panelists to tell me what we should know about accessing the press that we may not have covered today. And also for the audience to unmute if you have a specific question of how you can better leverage the press for your business in a positive way. Panelists, any comments, anything that we didn't cover that you think is useful for the audience in terms of what they should know and getting access to the press and coverage.
There's just one thing I'll mention. I think it's important to play off the news cycle, if you will. For instance, right now we're in hurricane season. If you have a client that has anything to do with emergency preparedness or say, maybe builds and sells generators, anything like that, you have a chance of getting them into the news, not maybe as a standalone story on them, but as expert sources on something that may occur. You have to know, if a reporter, you'd say there's an environmental reporter or somebody who probably is going to be tracking what's happening during a hurricane, especially if a storm is approaching. And you got to help them do their jobs. You got to help them find a source who can say, this is what you have to have in place. This is what people should be thinking about. So a little forethought about what's coming up in the news cycle, I think, can be very helpful.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim. Ed or John, any other parting advice?
No,
Well,
I think we covered a lot of the pertinent ways to reach the press.
Okay, thank you. Ed?
yeah, I think sort of from my standpoint, the most important thing is that if you call up looking to get a story that involves a business or an organization on the air and onto our website, that it has to be interesting to the people that listen to our radio station and go on to our website. But more important, it has to have a positive impact on them and on the communities in which they live. And even if you're not an advertiser, we have this wall between advertising and content that is presented. That if you come up with something that is going to help the communities, that is going to help someone in the community who has had a terrible thing happen to them, and and your business is going to supply them with something they desperately need, fine, you're going to get on the air with us because you're doing the right thing for the people that we are trying to do the right thing for.
Okay, thank you, Ed. And anyone in the audience have any questions before we part? If not, the only thing I'd like to say is thank you, Ed Perry, Jon Chesto, Jim Borghesani, for providing us with some insight and your time. One parting note from me is we do a monthly webinar. Our next webinar is October 27th, and it's about whether franchising is a sensible choice versus business startup. That will feature Dana Hall, who is a franchise consultant. And then in November, we're doing a webinar about web accessibility and how to make sure that your web is fully accessible to all people and the consequences if it is not. And that will be in mid-November. Don't worry, we'll spam you and let you know on a regular basis. So thanks, everybody. And we will make this recording available to everybody who wants it. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you down the road.
It's great to see everyone. Thanks a lot for having me.
Take care,
Thank you,
everybody.
John. Thank you, Ed.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much. And
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
we should all get together for a drink.